Live streaming is on.
Hello, Multiverse. My name is Gerry Fialka. It's January 3rd, 2021, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be here for a McLuhanMashUp with Clinton, Ignatov, and Marcin Kędzior. Thank you guys so much. You know, we're just jamming. As Frank Zappa made fun of Bob Marley, we're jamming. All art aspires to the condition of music. And one of the godheads of music is Sun Ra. And he said, space is the place. Now, in my little book called Architecture for Beginners, it says some great philosopher said that architecture is frozen music. And back to Zappa, Frank said that music is air molecule sculptures. So this is he saw this candle vibrating in his church, which is an amazing way for us to learn architecture. In fact, I had an experience where I saw a church in France, and it was built many years ago, and the church poked the eyes out of the architect, the man who built and designed the building, so that he could not go and make that building somewhere else. Wow, what a world of architecture. So we want to know this meta. We're in this McLuhanMashUp. We want to know the meta, the hidden psychic effects of architecture. And just to carry a little more, excuse me for this long intro, that Carl Andre, the great artist, said sculpture as place. So we are now in a Zoom, this architectural design, like our little boxes. And we're in a discarnate space. But it feels like all three of us are here. So, Marcin, we'll start with you. In your Scapegoat journal, you said we think through space. Could you elaborate on this difference between humans thinking and feeling, and how could we think through space?
Yeah, thanks, Gerry, and great to see you and Clint here for this chat. There's a couple of ways that mind has to report itself through language, as in kind of the confession box or Freud on the couch, through neural scans. It's some kind of like digital mapping of what's happening in your brain. There's got to be more models of how to understand what a mind is. Through Nietzsche and through his idea about a physiological basis for philosophy, and stuff you've been reading, Gerry, with Finnegan's Wake, about how dreams are related to the body and so on. There's a case to be made about what affects your body has a direct link to things you can think about. So Nietzsche's point that you have different kinds of thoughts when you're on a mountain, different kinds of thoughts when you're by the water. Basically, you're exposed to a different atmosphere and different situation. You think through the outside. We think in connection to the outside. The mind it's not an internal thought. It's about this interface, I guess, between, or as Diderot calls this, ambient realm that is around your body, that sends and receives signals. That is kind of how space can be thought of as something that has a direct influence on the mind and actually becomes the mind. Because then, like a Facebook feed, like a Facebook wall or your Instagram feed. That is literally your mind at that moment. If you're reading it, it's just a physical representation of your mind because you're thinking about all those things. So it's pretty interesting that we can get this map. Of course, you can have tangents from that. You can have daydreams. You can blank out in unexpected ways. But it is fascinating how that's what we call them platforms because they're plateaus, or they're spaces, and they're environments. And as you all know, McLuhan's point that the medium is the environment is a very profound point because it brings a spatial idea into this thing that we consider just a medium.
Yeah, let's let Clinton come in, because that was a lot, Marcin. That was heavy. I love your references to all these modern thinkers and thinkers of the past, but it almost sounded like Clinton could jump off into doom scrolling and platforms, or wherever you want to go. Clinton, how do you want to react to what he just said?
Oh, I think it's right on the money. Yes. Space as mind. I think is an excellent way to discuss how most of what our brain is doing is putting together an apparently coherent whole representation of what's happening outside of us. Right? There's as you said, there's a million ways to talk about it. You can call it a salience landscape, where what you're paying attention to is like this tactile caress of your attention moving across the landscape outside of you, and it's a gestalt. You're ignoring the rest, and you're paying attention to this, and you're paying attention to that. So, as you said, when you're looking at your news feed, you are probably, unless something really grabs you, shutting out everything else, right? And the fact that the tracing of what is salient to our mind from moment to moment to moment in our surrounding space as thinking, like that is a thought. I think that's a very, I wouldn't call it reductionist. I think it's sublimely simple and a very powerful sort of metaphor for that. It's kind of funny because what you're paying attention to, especially in our artificial world of, architecture and machines. There's been times when I'm sitting in a bar with one of my friends who's a construction worker, and they'll start pointing out flaws in the building, or, hey, look at that counter. It's like 2 degrees crooked. Look at that. Oh man, right? And they start right. And I would never have noticed, but the building itself is speaking to them in the terms which they are very familiar with, and then they'll start throwing all this jargon at me about pointing out, the shape of the room or anything like this. And this is because they were, as we might say, in their mind, the space itself as their mind was speaking to them as they, were idly giving it their gaze. So yeah, I think it's very elegant.
And Marcin, you both mentioned the word language. So, the brain reports to itself through language in your Scapegoat article. That was an amazing statement. So the brain is reporting to itself through language. And you brought up James Joyce and Finnegan's Wake. And then you followed that line with the brain reports itself through chemicals. And then how do you define what language is? Because to go back to music, what's more fundamental, music or language?
Oh, well, because language implicates all those things, I think the intermingling is what's interesting, Gerry, because you could have the differences between different kinds of music are more profound than the differences between different languages per se, because what matters is the usage of language and the usage of music. I could give you a usage that's a very regimented usage, and I could show you music that has some kind of regimentation, like marching band music or something. That's the interesting part, is the regime or the regime of use or organization is more significant than contrasting the realm of music with language, right? Just like there are regimented spaces and regimented sounds, and then there's floating sound and spaces that are totally deterritorialized or something. So the commonalities are almost, I think, in the regime of usage. But to get to your point, I think the kind of language I'm talking about there is one that tries to capture. So it's starting to act like architecture. I think architecture is an anomaly. The general condition is landscape. So the kind of constant flow of landscape. Architecture is just a temporary consolidation or structuring and making of a coherence of landscape, because all the materials are obviously landscape. And then after some time, the architecture will become landscape one more time. just like I think the general condition. Wait, go ahead.
So is landscape permanent and buildings aren't? Just to clarify what you just said.
Oh yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that's a poetic way of putting it. They're permanent in their constant flux. Yeah, they're permanent while they're entirely about transformation and movement, constant. But the last thing I want to bring in there is architecture is just a temporary stabilization of language. Like consciousness is just a temporary stabilization and coherence of the subconscious, which is more like the overall general field. So I don't contrast conscious versus subconscious, and this is actually closer to Freud, to what he says, which is the general field is the subconscious, and within that field, pockets of consciousness can pop up. It's not a question of this versus that. It's the general condition of the landscape and the subconscious. When language tries to capture it, it's functioning like architecture. There's no one-to-one connection between a word like anger and the sensation and the phenomenon inside and outwards. Because at what point is it anger? At what point is it rage? At what point is it wrath? It's like it's silly. There's no connection. The language is a rebuilding in a very different form. Same as this crazy reduction of the body having 5 senses or something, right? That's a question from Aristotle. Aristotle's idea about 5 senses. We don't have 5 senses. How can you relegate touch, the whole body? Okay, like the head is some weird sensing machine. Everything happens in the face, and then the rest of the body is touch. Okay, well you get it. So that's the first clue something's wrong there. The overcoding, the political dominance of the face as the capital, as the architecture, takes over from the body. Scuba divers report senses of pressure on their body, senses of gravity, senses of movement. Movement's a freaking sense. Why do people go rollerblading? Well, maybe they don't anymore, but there's this impetus to move. You feel something. Yeah. Why is pain the same as tickling? Or eroticism transforms all the senses and it brings them all in and reconfigures them. Burning, like even hot and cold are different from each other. I think they affect different parts of your skin. It's not even a continuum. So anyway, so this is my problem, Gerry, is that language can define and overcode and build little architectures to define the mind and to define the body. And then there's always these limits where you say, no, actually, the body is more like this landscape or this unconscious that we have to deal with.
Yeah. Clinton, anything you wanted to add? Because I got some others, but please feel free.
Now I'm thinking of all these terms which have come up to try and encapsulate a broader spectrum of senses, like the kinesthetic sense or the proprioceptive sense, right? Proprioceptive being like, where is my body right now when my eyes are closed? Like, have you ever been laying in your bed and you think your arm is somewhere, and as soon as you roll over, you're like, oh, whoa. Like, total shock, as though, right? I especially remember all these terms coming up in conversations about VR, which was like, there's more books written on the subject of VR and what it meant in the 90s before anyone actually, started experiencing it en masse, right? Anyway, so yeah, no, that's absolutely right. But it sort of comes back to something about bodies themselves as being the thinking or being the self, right? Your body is the self, as opposed to like these sort of more abstract concepts or categories that we've inherited culturally.
Really good, because McLuhan had a great one-liner on his playing cards with cute aphorisms, and it said, message to deep sea diver: surface at once, boat is sinking. So when you said the scuba diving, that was so good. Hey, you're down there swimming, but we're supplying you with the oxygen, but we're sinking, so you better surface at once. There's so much going. It sounds like a stupid thing. These cute little stupid jokes that McLuhan would tell really are deeper, and that's what we're going for. This, like, what are the psychic hidden effects of coming up with language to define our senses? Because I agree with you, and I love it, because we talk a lot about the 5 senses in doing tetrads, which is 4. And we're always asking, come up with a 5th new question. We're not settling for 4. And McLuhan said this thing that every human invention extends some humanness. So Marcin, what does the building extend? Because I think you touch on this. And what I'm amazed at is how much, and you can tell us a little your background, how much McLuhan you really ever consumed, but so much of what you know overlaps. And it's very good for that to happen, because McLuhan was sort of blackballed out of academia, sort of, because he's treated as a charlatan. So, what is your history of coming into McLuhan, and especially because your tetrads are amazing, and I don't think you did them before you talked with us in the last year since we started studying Finnegan's Wake together. And then the building is an extension of what humanness?
Cool. Yeah. Just to respond to one other thing first. All my McLuhan is from Gerry and from Clinton. Well, originally, Gerry, you're the one that got me thinking about it, and I saw a bunch of videos by Clinton, and then I watched some lectures by McLuhan recently, just because I was thinking of you guys. My thoughts are more grounded in the writing of Gilles Deleuze, but there's some interesting concepts of the probe head that maybe, if you guys care to talk about that later, that relates to McLuhan's idea of a probe as something that escapes subjectivity and signification. Humanizing, ever since that Vitruvian Man photo, picture, that everyone quotes, I read that as the alignment of the human with geometry in order to make the case that the human is related to architecture and also the cosmos as well. So suddenly, just connecting humans to geometry means that you connect humans to architecture, because those are domes and those are kind of facades, kind of rectangles and squares, but also the movement of the celestial bodies. So my tactic here is always drawing, clearing paths, not even building bridges, because the paths are already there. So you can clear the path between architecture and a human, or kind of a body. Try to understand how both are made. Try to understand, they both literally use calcium. I mean, the calcium is like ground up seashells, and coral that is in the sand, that makes its way into soil. Cows are like amazing calcium translating machines that, the grass is like 0.2% calcium, I believe. The same material that goes into your bones goes into the mortar and the kind of basis for concrete and all these other materials. So it's kind of amazing, the connections in terms of structure, but also the idea of the body being defined by its outside and by the constant sustenance that what it really needs is, in the human, like air, sun, food, and then the things that architecture actually responds to the city and the materials that it implicates, the labor that it implicates. And then, I'm responding to your question on several different levels, but we also talked about how kids putting up posters in their room. That's also another way that their mind or what they're thinking about is physically presented, like just the objects you arrange, the things you have with you. They could be also historical or kind of tied to your ancestry, or they could be cave drawings these are the things we're thinking about, and this is what's preoccupying us. So you occupy the architecture. That's your occupation, not just your job, but your psychic occupation.
Yeah, that was good. That's Frank Zappa always said, or he would sing in his song, the kid retreating to their lonely teenage room. It was a way for all people listening to find this common, like Robin Williams calls it, womb service. Like this, it's the mother's womb. But Marcin, please go back and tell us in more layperson's terms. One is what got you into Deleuze, and what was the crossover with the word probe? It went by so fast. You have to reiterate that, because that to me is very important for us to have this weaving of us three.
Yeah, you guys, I'm sure you guys know more about the way McLuhan uses probe, but it strikes me that Deleuze has Deleuze, it's related to Deleuze's concept of a probe head. He talks about a lot in the faciality chapter of 1,000 Plateaus, where he talks about the it's funny he used the word wall, the white wall, which is sounds like a Facebook wall, but the wall is a wall of signification, meaning the wall is where you encode meaning. So meaning is transcribed on the wall. The other thing the face has is black holes. The black holes are about subjectification, meaning just how you are captured by a certain way of defining yourself, right? So we all have multiple kinds of subjectification holes that you fall into. You could be, you're the brother, or you're the son, or you're the sister, or you're this particular occupation, or this particular job, or your this particular group. So or a subgroup. These are all kind of subjectifying forces that are making you think about yourself a certain way, it's disturbing if you push that to the limit, because it means that you are in a sense designed. In a sense, you're designed because in a sense, your deepest interiority, your sense of self, even the fact that you understand you have a sense of self, that could be designed. Or as Mark Woodley says, when you go into a shop and someone holds up a shirt and says, "This shirt is so you," and then you're like, "Oh yeah, okay, I'm great," because I didn't know who I was before, but if I buy this thing now, I will consolidate and construct my sense. It's resonating with certain subcultures. So the probe for Deleuze is a way of escaping both a capturing of meaning, because once it's understood, or when it means something, that's also a bit of a trap, or means you can't really go anywhere with it anymore, because instead of what it means, you should ask, what does it do? What does it function with? How does it transmit intensities? What else does it connect to? It escapes meaning, as also it escapes subjectification. It doesn't try to capture you as a kind of individual in a certain social frame. So, and I got, yeah, I guess it's a longer story why I got into Deleuze, but it was my favorite reading group ever. But originally I was into Nietzsche and then Foucault and then Deleuze. I mean, that's the simple.
Right, but to follow that through line, you were first choosing your path as an architect, and then you got into these thinkers, or that was all integrated all along? You were in high school studying what, and then you says, well, I'm going to pursue an architectural career, but I'm going to interweave it with Joyce and philosophy. But just sort of suss out that through line.
I was doing a undergrad in fine arts. I was studying fine arts at Queens, and then instead of making objects or artifacts, I started getting interested in the whole space and kind of more of a curatorial idea. And then from the room, I started getting interested in larger and larger scale. So I think it was a process of scaling up and trying to think about people in relationship to the thing, not just artifacts in their own right. So I think it was a bit of that movement outwards that was led to the thinking about doing grad school in architecture, and then only after that through one of my mentors, Adrian Blackwell, we did some public space projects together, and we were reading Deleuze together in that little very intense reading group, which I love reading groups more than any kind of class I've taken. Are the kind of most interesting kinds of experiences, right?
Yeah, you're a shining star in the Boston Wake, Finnegan's Wake group, and we love it. But just to go back to Deleuze for a second, and McLuhan sort of liked, I think, the word probe, and Clinton could clarify, because he was about inventing new questions and new metaphors rather than saying, oh, I have the answers. In fact, I think John Cage says it best. You ask John Cage a question, he goes, that's a very good question. I wouldn't want to ruin it with an answer. So what is that similar to what Deleuze is saying with the word probe? invent new questions and new metaphors, not necessarily the answers.
Yeah, I think Deleuze is one of those. He comes from that line of philosophy where questions get the answer they deserve. So yeah, the point is formulating the question is the hard part. Yeah, and the kind of ambiguity of not taking a moral stance, that seems to be important to let the probe follow through. But I also wonder if Clinton thinks there's a connection to like weather probes or kind of like probes like satellites as a kind of probe. Like there might be some other kind of connotation of that I'm not aware of too.
Yeah, it's in full. The idea is probing the common environment that you and your discussants are attempting to even reach and subjectively share. If you're not even in the same dimension as everyone else, right? And so questions aren't meant to be answered per se. You're trying to shake up your people out of their securities into new modes of thinking. You're always being hyperbolic and exaggerating, and so there's the lack of moral judgment is also about because McLuhan studied lots of classical orators like Cicero and the nature of rhetoric and sophistry, and so he has these techniques. He's very deliberate about using techniques to throw people off guard and or convince them out of stuff, right? So he's trying to be a proper orator in a postmodern environment, and so probing your mind, probing the environment together. Hey, what's that over there? You didn't think of it this way, did you? Right? That sort of thing, and then hopefully coalescing into some close, tighter form of communication there around through the discussion, right? That's the idea of probing for him. It's ultimately constructive after the unsettling part of this guy asking all these weird questions you'd never heard before.
Nice, I love that. Great, that's really nice. Deleuze had another thing about answering a question with another question, but yeah, reminds me of this whole like, what happens if you just hijack and don't go through with the answer because it just the point is you're kind of following some kind of experimental path that you don't know where it will lead, and so there's a lot in Deleuze about writing the map. The difference between a map and a tracing. The map is what you write at the time of you as you draw it. It creates the world, so it actually kind of creates a whole new territory as you draw it, and in a kind of because Gerry mentioned jamming and this idea of like just an entry into the unknown. Through this kind of almost like an improvisatory framework.
Mm-hmm. But Marcin, it seems as though architecture is such, you can't jam. You go, here's your space, build me a building, and you can be creative, but you have to end somewhere and go, here's your building. So I mean, the process is the jamming, but can you talk about that? You have an end product.
Yeah, that's a great question. Might be one where I've been more into public space design, but I think one problem there, Gerry, with how you frame that is that the building isn't done when it's built. It's actually just begun.
That's right.
No, the building's not ever done. It's actually pretty interesting where the jamming is the sound and sunlight and animals running through it and the dinner parties and the unpredictable decades into the future, what happens with the spaces? Will they shift? Will they remodel it? I'm trying to think about something called design for deconstruction. Can you never demolish again? Never demolish, only carefully deconstruct, disassemble, so that you can use the same pieces on site or somewhere else. Since the materials have an embodied energy and a cultural value that is very interesting to think about materials as the main unit and components as the main unit, not the architecture, because the architecture as a static object, as a unity, is pretty uninteresting. What's interesting is interior spaces that perfectly match social conditions that are also transformable, and the interface between that and the larger city that's also in flux. And architecture just mediates between urbanism and your dining room or whatever that particular social form is. But the idea of deconstruction is that the materials keep jamming after the life of the building is exhausted, or it's a reincarnation. It starts to become something else in the future.
That was beautiful, because indeed, being in Venice, California for 40 years, I see my block completely change. And I'm just in a little 2-door garage and lived happily here for 40 years. But all up and down my street, most of these beautiful little homes were taken down and built into big buildings, 2 or 3 story houses. And it seems as though there's some law that when you tear an old house down, you have to leave a third of one wall up. Do you know about this law?
Yeah, it's different in every neighborhoods. Have different regulations about, and it's silly, and it becomes facadism if it's just like preserve the image of the building. I think that's annoying. That's not how I think about history. First of all, it has to be a living history. History is also intangible. It's more interesting to try to evoke the social and cultural associations, or the way something was built, or the way the structure related to a social form. Try to evoke that through as a heritage, not the image of a building. But different neighborhoods have different laws around that, or kind of different regulations about what it means to kind of fit into the neighborhood and guard against the kind of transformation needed.
It seems like this funny juggling act that architects and builders have to work around to sort of fake like they're fulfilling the law to have this little part of the old still there. But it's interesting. Oh, go ahead, Clint.
Yeah, the spirit of that. It's funny. I'd like to bring in a comparison to literature, just because I've been reading this lately. But Cutie Leavis was saying that novelists have a much harder time in the 20th century because their readers are very fractured, and so modernist writers are either going to go over people's heads, or they just have to write generic stuff for everyone and compromise their artistic vision or what have you. McLuhan had his own take on this, which was that in the 20s, authors stopped writing stuff down and taking notes meticulously. They stopped journal writing, and they stopped making a scrapbook of their little insights throughout the day about some poetic thing they saw in this person's smile or that thing on the street. And so they weren't stuffing their pockets with notes like they had been beforehand, maybe due to more media or different forums or more discussion or distractions during wartime. And so he saw and so what happened was that the mass single memory, that mass media said, remember that day, when this happened, we all went through this, the one singular media constructed memory of events sort of became the subject of stories. They filled that vacuum. So when you talk about the living history of a room, I'm thinking with the living history of a building and what's to be preserved, what you need to do is mine the experiences of the people who occupied those buildings. It's inhabitants and their habits, right? So their stories within the relation of that building. It's kind of funny. That's the point of a television pilot that David Lynch did for HBO in 1993 called Hotel Room. And so it was just a whole bunch of small vignettes over the course of decades that all took place in sort of if these walls had eyes, a single hotel room, right, over the course of decades and whatnot. So it's just fascinating how that facet would seem to be essential to the architectural goal there. And what did you call it? Reconstruction?
Deconstruction.
Yes, architectural deconstruction, though, as opposed to demolition.
That's right. Yeah, that's great. That's an amazing example. I want to look up that Lynch thing. I think this whole field is known as intangible heritage too, where festivals, rituals, and Clinton mentioned the habits. These things are the life of the city, right? They're not about like the architecture. Yeah, there's an interplay with the physical material, but the material shouldn't be mistaken as the point. The point is how to preserve, I'll use the word preserve, cultivate kind of living rituals and habits and practices, because these are the ones that give us access to alternate ways of thinking and feeling and relating to each other.
Mm-hmm.
What do you how do you differentiate deconstruction from reconstruction in layperson's terms?
Okay, well, to me, just reconstruction sounds like you're going to restore it, meaning kind of just rebuild it as it is. Deconstruction is really, I mean, not to be confused with the Derrida deconstruction, although it has some interesting comparison to it as a philosophical idea. If you want, because I know Gerry, you live next to some Frank Gerry buildings, so he's known as a deconstructor. Well, maybe can I talk about that for a second? He's known as a deconstructivist, but he's actually an interesting case of reacting to a perceived absence of history in modernism. You know, like the kind of almost like the stereotype of the glass steel architecture that's devoid of context and kind of I'm thinking like Mies van der Rohe, that looks like it's has no history, right? Frank Gerry's reacting to that and saying, well, what's the oldest thing we have around? It happens to be fish, or their kind of evolutionary history of 300 million years. And so he gets obsessed with fish. So if you look at his early buildings and like lamp designs, they're all about the literal images of fish. But eventually he stops being interested in fish as this ancient thing and starts getting interested in the movement of the fish and also the light reflection of the scales, and uses those as kind of phenomenological characteristics in the architecture. So he brings us from that ancient, millions of years of history to the present experience, and he starts this company called Gerry Technologies, using CATIA software used for the modeling of in the aerospace industry, like for spaceships and airplane 3D models, because it's really good at quantifying curvatures of steel. He brings us into this kind of future realm. So Gerry can occupy all these past, present, and future spaces through the way he operates as a kind of way of thinking about deconstructing modernism. But that was more than you were asking for, Gerry. But there is a deconstructivism in architecture and in philosophy, so that's why it's a little confusing. But the way I'm using it is different, which is it's an alternative to demolition. It basically, we should understand where our materials came from and what the hell you're working on. Clinton mentioned this kind of literary, and it also made me think of like intertextual, how books are made of fragments of other pieces, and you can think about kind of archaeological layers to your own architecture. But at least you should know where it came from, who worked on it, what was the kind of labor and the kind of local skill that went into it. And then you don't demolish, you deconstruct. Be careful. If you use the word disassemble, in order to preserve the material and components, instead of really just get sent to the landfill, like one of the hugest producers of waste and energy is the construction industry. But there's got to be a better way of rethinking how this material circuit works, and thinking again from the point of view of cultural value in the material. Associated stories, associated heritage, of the stuff that Clinton was talking about, the kind of rituals, and also just nerdy embodied energy, because it took some energy to make this brick or this steel, and that's still in the material. That energy is still there.
Yeah, that. Say it again, Clinton.
Soylent buildings.
Soylent buildings, Soylent Green.
Buildings.
What you reminded me of was Pomo Decon, which is what I used to always say to all the highbrow intellectuals we'd talk to. I go, that's Pomo Decon, postmodern deconstruction. I didn't even know what I was talking about, but I love this because you must have ESP, Marcin, because you brought up Frank Gerry, who gave Finnegan's Wake to Jay-Z, and we'd love to know the history of that, why he's into the wake. And then we've studied this Mohali Naji film recently, and how in the heck did this architect or this designer graphed out Finnegan's Wake in a chart, like of all people to do that. But then you go back to your term that I loved you introducing called living history. And what I've learned, Nathan, one of our great members too, says, I say, well, Joyce invented the internet and disguised it as a book. And he goes, well, no, maybe Joyce invented the reading group and disguised it as a book. And then you say the reading group of Finnegan's Wake is a living organism. It's not your traditional reading book. Reading clubs are usually, people sitting around reading a book and discussing it, but they're not really reading it out loud. The ritual of Finnegan's Wake is you have to look at the text and read it out loud with a group of people. I mean, that is sort of the essential. So maybe you can tell us the through line, and when did the Wake and Joyce come into your architectural thinking? Like, was that your mentor saying, here's Deleuze and also here's Joyce, or where did that come in just that crossover of ESP, Frank Gehry, and living?
Yeah, I'm glad you're into that book too. If it is a book, yeah, Joyce invented the reading group, and that's interesting. Yeah, because Finnegan is a builder, and at some point referred to as an architect, big master. Interestingly, using the medieval idea about building master, not architect, meaning there's more of a collaboration with the crafts. When you're reading Finnegan's Wake in a group, first of all, like you say, it has to be read in a group, and the group perpetually and collectively constructs and deconstructs the text. So I think there is the kind of idea you tackle a sentence. There's a bit of a deconstruction and a construction and a tentative agreement. The group just decide, yes, okay, I think we got it. Let's move on. So I love that process. It's like a very political. It's like you're consoling your appetites. Like, what do you feel like? Sushi, pizza, and then you have to like align your bodies. Oh, what did I eat yesterday? Like, what did I read? The night before. You have to kind of physically almost agree. Yes, I feel like this resonates with my nervous system. Let's move on to the next one. Yeah, Joyce, man, it came through a whole different stream, man. It's a good question. I think, I know Clinton's interested in this idea too, to Gideon, who I know less about, but my frame of reference is the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus is reacting to the perceived loss of cultural life in objects. There's a big scandal in a way of the 1856 Crystal Palace exhibition in London, where the U.S. and Britain are producing these mass-produced objects, and then it's a shock to Gottfried Semper, who says, "Wait, the mass production and machines, well, it's replacing our cultural artifacts that seem to have embodied a kind of cultural life." So the Bauhaus tries to reconcile craft with mass production, but it does so interestingly by imbuing objects with life, with a particular idea about life, through a very specific design process of iterations. The iterations are just repetitions that almost imitate a genetic kind of evolutionary transformation, where objects take on an effective force. So this transformed pedagogy in the world, but especially in the United States, where a lot of the Germans and other politicians from the Bauhaus, they started Harvard. The design school at Harvard was led by them, at Yale, in Chicago, IIT. These are all Bauhaus trained and professors from the Bauhaus. So we can talk more about that idea about how life is in the objects, but you can see, I hope it's not reductive, but almost every early modernist painting movement and art movement is compensating for a perceived loss of life. So the impressionist kind of animation through light as kind of animacy and vibrancy. The surrealist as thinking about how the subconscious brings in a counter to the rationalism. You could frame it all about different ways of introducing life into the world. So, but for me, Gerry, I have like my two favorite professors were Adrian Blackwell, who I talked about, and then Diane Lewis, who taught at Cooper Union for a long time. But she was a disciple of John Haydock, whose whole project was about history and modernism. And he trained with I.M. Pei, who trained with Gropius, who founded the Bauhaus. So that's my tentative line to the Bauhaus and how it relates to that whole literary history. There's a particular crew at the Bauhaus who's very interested in that. Not necessarily the Gropius Harvard crew, but the Joseph Albers Black Mountain College, later Yale, and then the whole nudge connection to. Yeah, a lot of not everyone, but there's a bit of that. The people that care about artists and literature and this idea about this cultural life question, that's the stream of the Bauhaus that I'm very excited about.
That's awesome. May I, Gerry?
Yeah, Clinton, hold on one second, because you mentioned Cage was in Black Mountain, and Cage got into the wake through McLuhan. He says, dude, you got to do McLuhan. I mean, excuse me, McLuhan said to Cage, you got to do the wake. And that's why he got, but Clinton should Gideonize us now or something.
Well, it's funny because just based on what I've been interested in, what I've been reading mostly is books from the first part of the 20th century. So I've gone to go and try to look at how Gideon is understood today, and it's he had a quaint, very originalist view of art criticism as a student of the guy who invented art criticism directly, right? If his name comes to me, I'll remember.
Not Vasari or not Vasari. Oh no, I'm thinking old school art history. Maybe that's old.
It's Gideon in Space, Time, and Architecture. He was looking at the balance between heart and mind as expressed in the forms of building, and so it particularly say in Europe, the constant neoclassical revivals would be this already dead, done form of fake stone, which was plastered superficially as a veneer on top of a steel construct that was erected, right? And so architecture was this this superficial give the client what they want, right? The nouveau riche, the demand for buildings came from people with no taste because they got rich in the growing in the growing capitalist environment, not out of a sense of historical tradition, right? But simultaneously, parallel to that is the rise of construction. As that's really interesting. Big master means like building master. That's extremely relevant because he sees like construction and like steel and trusses and mass produced things and whatnot as these as these very functional ugly forms that slowly had to be humanized at the same time, while architects had to get over their fear of integrating these new forms, especially concrete, into the actual appearance of the building, as opposed to constantly trying to hide, like cover them up and whatnot. And so in the narrative he paints, right, the pinnacle is the Eiffel Tower, because Eiffel was building bridges in the middle of nowhere for trains, and all of a sudden this giant ugly mass of iron got erected in the middle of one of the most important cities of Europe, right? And so it was like destroying the psyche of what had been the now long beat over the head classical architecture, which Napoleon extravagantly made so ornamental and lush and suffocating that you couldn't even think straight in Napoleon's aesthetic style of France and all this stuff, right? So that's just the gist of the story that he's telling, but it's about this balance between being smothered in humanism with no form or logic or reason, compared to these highly efficient, highly reasonable, workable buildings that are ugly and inhuman that no one would ever want to live in, right? And the heart and the mind balance as being reflected in that by societies. So yeah, that's the best I can boil it down anyway. But it seems to be relevant, at least. Yeah.
And Marcin, just going off on that balance thing, I just read this Thomas Troward quote: "The great secret in life is learning to see things in their wholeness and to realize the inside and the outside simultaneously." So that's all cute and Hallmark cardy. Yeah, we got to know the inside and the outside. Like McLuhan, we got to know the psychic hidden effects, not ignore them. That's why Pound said artists are the intent of the race. They're broadcasting the hidden psychic effects. So why do we have to rely on balance? Because we don't really want to balance the heart and mind, because isn't the human condition not to be in balance, and how we cope with it? I mean, are we striving to get to a balance, or are we striving to cope with the, off kilterness that one dominates over the other one?
Yeah, cool question. Very interesting. I mean, I would always guard away from a balance between two variables, because I don't think that's as intense or complicated as it can be. So there's always at least a couple more. But I think the one answer, I guess, is the Japanese garden is really beautiful, if I could use the word, because it tries to deliberately lower the power of something that's becoming over dominant. I think one idea about balance is that you just don't want homogeneity. You don't want one thing to dominate in a kind of almost like a monopoly or a oppressive structure. So if one thing becomes too powerful, it will negate the other complexity of the variables at play. So in the Japanese garden, they say it's architecture and water and rocks and plant life. So not one of them can get too powerful. If something gets too powerful, you have to boost or lesser other things in order to allow this kind of ecological interplay to really speak and be visible, right? One of the best writers about all of this is really Karen Barad. Amazing, like just the best writer of our time, I think, and talks a lot about how to cut things. We have this whole thing in the world, and we're always cutting it into inside, outside, or into different kinds of dichotomies. She says, well, there's so many ways of cutting, and she kind of walks you through how to cut in very unexpected ways. But in the end, there's this idea about intra-action. Intra-action as whatever you do in the world, it shapes the world as well as shaping you at the same time. So ultimately, she thinks the fundamental dichotomy that guides many other dichotomies is culture and nature. Right, because it's like the underpinning of many other ones, like primitive and civilized, or even man and woman, and there's many that kind of follow from that division. And I think it has something to do with what Clinton was saying, because of the neoclassical and kind of classical revivals as a kind of architectural exemplification of a civilized culture versus the kind of raw materiality, or the kind of of concrete, at least, is most visible, the brutalism of it. But she says, no, there is no culture in nature as such. There isn't even a nature as such. What there is relations with nature. So if you have a rifle and you're out hunting, that is a different nature, my friend, than if you're there with like a landscape painting brush. Or if you're swimming, or if you're scuba diving, a different nature emerges. Not only that, but a different you emerge. So there's a effect on your subjectivity, like how you understand yourself, right? Because of the technology or the tool you use as the interface with nature, that's what creates the nature, while creating your own sense of self at that moment. So isn't that amazing, compared to saying there's some kind of universal nature that's always the same, and some kind of cultural entity, right? But the point is there's relations, and the relations construct you and the world at the same time.
Yeah, it resonates completely, Marcin. With McLuhan was asked, will there ever be silence? And he said, things don't exist on their own. They only exist in relationship. So the whole thing of Cage creating the silent piece of music 433, and he went into the chamber, and we can hear silence. If me, you, and Clinton go out to the desert right now, I swear we could sit on a rock and hear silence. But that's because we heard the sound of our feet on the sand walking to that rock, and then our car driving to that point. But this woman's name is Karen Baron, Baron.
Last name Barad, Barad. She's from California.
Barad. Okay, so you brought up something that I really stupidly ignored at the beginning, was that Churchill said we shape our buildings, then they shape us. And this is the beauty of what Marshall was doing throughout his career, was, well, don't settle for these cute statements, reword them. And he said, well, he got this one of his aphorisms from that, we shape our tools, then they shape us. That, and also his whole thing on new nature was just like what you just said was what Marshall called the new nature. But I would love to hear your take, and Clinton's too, on this. It just sounds too simpleton and too easy for Marshall to say, well, we shape our tools, then they shape us. Especially knowing where Churchill came up with that. Why was he saying that? Then Marshall morphing it into not just buildings, but everything shapes us. What does that mean? That just sounds too cute. Like, oh, our tools shape us. So maybe we should start with Clinton. He's cracking up there. But either of you, I mean, what are these two gentlemen really saying? The deep hidden.
It sort of ties into something I was talking about with something I hadn't gotten to regarding Gideon earlier, and that is Gideon's concept of anonymous history. The fact that the few names from history of inventors or creators or great men or what have you are the exception to the fact that we've inherited this entire total artifice of a world not knowing who it was who designed or built or created most of it. So Gideon's first book was on architecture. His second one, Mechanization Takes Command, he spent like 12 years in patent offices, looking through every iteration of every small patent on bathtubs, office chairs, all these various small mechanical creations, looking at the random inventors, mostly in America, which had a robust patent system in the 1800s, sort of telling the story of the evolution of the objects in everybody's home, and situating them in the story of how it is they came to be invented in the larger scheme of the development of mechanization, from the erasure of handicrafts in the 1600s straight up to the modern day. It's sort of this technique of re-imbuing with this sort of energy, or this idea of like showing that everything around you has this sort of human dimension story, origin story, belongs in the slipstream of the greater narrative or the greater historical forces from which they originated, right? And so when you say that our objects shape us, first we make our tools, and then our tools shape us. There was a designer for that tool who had an intention in making it, and if they did their job right, which they probably did, if it caught on and everyone owns one now, a potato peeler is an example from a recent book I was reading, right? There's an intention. There's a statement. It's almost like a verbal sentence imbued in the design that says, "Rub this part on the potato." And you'll peel your potato, right? That's what a potato peeler is, as a spoken utterance sentence by the creator who invented it, and it ended up in your knife drawer, right? But absent that meaning and that sense of historical placement, you're definitely more of the Deleuze guy than I am. I get it all secondhand, but I understand that there's a sense of deterritorialization when we're cut off from the story of the environment that we're in, and specifically when things get all mechanical and mass produced and simulated, if you'd like, or copies of forms, they lose their human dimension therein. And so it was part of this, he spent 12 years in a patent office looking to try and demonstrate how to restore the human scale and the human intention into the otherwise materializing, simulating, deterritorializing words. So that's just the second half of what Gideon was all about, I think, which is more relevant even to your question, Gerry, because my tools shaped me, but really the guy who figured out how to create a better potato peeler shaped me. I just don't give him the credit. He doesn't come to mind. Right? Our objects shape us because we're using this world, and what it affords us is what we end up having to dwell within. But we blame the tools when we can't give an origin to the tools.
Great point. Marcin, you want to comment on that whole idea, what Churchill was saying and what Clinton just said? Because it's funny, because I would say one little just slip in is Duchamp would say, like, it's not the artist, it's the art. So it's not the potato peeler inventor, it's the potato peeler. But I love what you said, Clinton, because there's a human behind that.
Yeah, it's really cool point from a architecture point of view. We have these systems of cartography imposing the grid all over the world. You have like your entire city is an entirely constructed environment that has this mockery of nature in a way, like with a little tree on your front lawn or something, but it's all asphalt and concrete and materials otherwise. So it's an entirely constructed environment. The sophistication and the degree of control and ordering that we've imposed on the environment. Wait for it. What if that order and that sense of design is reversed back onto the human body, so that all the sophisticated techniques that you've created to order the world, and what Sanford Quinter calls, that is your freedom, because your freedom is about a detachment from the environment, because you're no longer susceptible to the influence of the environment. That's why you're free, but it came from ordering, or you order the environment to become free from it. But what if all your sophisticated forms of ordering in a perverse way are reversed back on you to order bodies, regiment bodies from, in schools, in factories, in prisons, in hospitals. They regiment the social and the psychological kind of nature of a human as well. And I don't have to tell you right now, the biotechnical, the kind of another sphere of it is, of course I'm grateful for all Fauci. I totally have to make clear that I am pro-vaccine. But the point is that all of these, it's an amazing thing that there is a vaccine that is going to get something that is part of you. Like all these organisms and bacteria become part of you, but we can engineer that because that's also part of the design project. So the way that all of the sophisticated forms of ordering are reversed back towards you. The last thing to throw in there, though, in this new kind of what Quinter says, or Mumford actually calls it the biotechnic. The biotechnic is the next frontier, where the machinic and the organic are reconciled. And in a way, the Bauhaus that we mentioned is the beginning of industrial design, which has as its goal this kind of thing that you could talk about, both of you, about McLuhan's idea about the extension of the body. The industrial design is just the way designing in a way that machines become an extension of what a body can do. But the disturbing point, if you read, I had a trippy time reading Quinter next to Darwin. I had a trippy time because what came out of that was that Darwin doesn't use uses evolution only once as a word, but normally talks about adaptation to your conditions of your existence. The disturbing thing is a body no longer needs to adapt to the conditions of your existence because we've redesigned the conditions of the existence. So the body can stay the same. But it turns out, to my mind, the most seamless integration into the conditions of your existence is entertainment, surprisingly. Entertainment is the most kind of automatic, perfect integration into an environment that's entirely constructed, that you are engaging in. That is, it's not just mundane. It's extremely exciting. Well, your body doesn't register it because it's just like sitting there, but there's fireworks going on inside because there's sociality. There's friends and Seinfeld are literally in your living room or you're in their neighborhood. You're part of your social scene. You feel a loneliness, but loneliness is compensated for by the social relationship you have. But the more you watch TV, let's say, the more lonely you become. That's like David Foster Wallace's argument about why TV is like a drug. It presents itself as the remedy for the problems it causes. But entertainment is the smoothest integration into the conditions of your existence because of the way it see how it I guess it pushes Darwin to the limit and says the whole environment is designed so your body doesn't have to adapt to it anymore. The environment adapts to it. You can control it.
Boy, that was a good intro to our next session someday, Marcin. I hope you'll join us. Is it entertainment or is it art? Because that's my definition of great art is when it fucks your shit up and says, I can do that. You know, like looking at a Pollock, a normal person would go, anybody could do that. And then like, you know, what is this? So that was beautiful because you anticipated my next question. But before we go into it, is the city an extension of the central nervous system?
Yeah. Of the central nervous system. Yeah, it's I don't know. It's an extension of your body. It's an extension of your body. I have I don't know if you guys agree, but I have a bit of a division. I don't know. Maybe I'm not being a great Karen Barad disciple here, but the physical lines are a bit different than the communicative lines. To me, when things are about communication, that's slightly different than the physical, because I'm still with Joyce on this, or at least how I understand Joyce is that you need the city, you need the physical material, then you need the story, you need the literary, which is more like the soul or something that animates the physical material. So, you know, I'm more into thinking about bodies as you know, the extent of your body. That's important in the city, but then the extent of your imagination and communicative possibilities is entirely different. As a way of thinking about what a place is. A place is just the extent of your body and your imagination and your communicating possibilities and how they interact with others. And in a world where you have like 20 tabs open, those are ways that you can occupy many spaces at once. You know, you're on Facebook and Gmail and New York Times article, whatever. You're in multiple places at once. You have this like funny simultaneously stretching your body. So those are all places that you're inhabiting simultaneously. So you see how, yeah, the city even sounds retrograde now that I think about it, because space has already been revolutionized by all these other communicative technologies.
That was good. Clint, you want to answer that or attempt? Is the city an extension of the central nervous system?
So I think you're getting this from McLuhan saying that electricity is an extension of the central nervous system. And he also said that the city is an exteriorization of the sensus communis, which is, I guess, a Thomistic term for where all of your senses come together in the right ratio to give you a sense of the total picture. So the common sense. So is the city common sense? What or would have been McLuhan's postulation? And is electricity an extension of our central nervous system because it's not a mechanical action? It's directly from something straight out of our skull that's going down the telegraph wire immediately to the point where you can call it an extension, right? So the city itself, maybe now that I'm a Luddite, funny enough, you might find, but you're probably more likely to meet strangers in your city through an app now than you would be through going to a bar and talking to the strangers over there and overhearing a conversation and chiming in from across the room, right? It's something I tend to do a lot, but that's because, again, I'm trying to inhabit these different alternate spaces, technologically speaking, from what the norm is that I see taking on, right? So I'm trying to go retrograde in the city to see what's still there, and it's still very workable and whatnot. But I end up talking to people, you know, twice my age at least, more often than not, because of, you know, who's going to be reciprocal to embodied city dwelling, you know, camaraderie. You know, it's an interesting experiment. So yeah, the city definitely is today an extension of the central nervous system, though, Gerry, because electricity is what's recommunalizing this cityscape of otherwise cosmopolitan strangers.
Yeah, this is good, and I really appreciate both of you teaching me so much, because when you brought up David Foster Wallace and the word drugs, he said TV is a drug. Remind me of Marshall wrote a letter to Pound in 1951. He said, the word is now the cheapest, most universal drug. Does the city need literature to orient itself to the world? Marcin.
Yeah, it needs a. Can we talk about myth as part of that? I think not. Yeah, not just literature. I guess literature understood very broadly as mythic ideas about subcultures. Every group, every subculture has a kind of myth, and every kind of grounds for a kind of identity. I think that's what's interesting. That maybe threw me off a bit in your central nervous system question, but Clinton, I think broached it well with this idea that the city is kind of a collage of multiple subcultures and multiple neighborhoods, right? Like a very interesting. What's interesting about cities is how they overlap and rub against each other and talk to each other, and how you have an alternate kind of way of paying attention, maybe even a different way of walking, or maybe you would understand how you speak differently depending on which part of the neighborhood you were in. So isn't that crazy how language and all these different things and your whole internal state can vary with the kind of territory you're in. And I think that Deleuze's idea about territory is actually better understood as that kind of psychological interior state that uses spaces and materials. But I think that the interesting thing is, I guess the question, who we are, who are you? I know Clinton likes Through the Looking Glass, but you guys read the little article with Winter, but I asked him about my weird reading of Humpty Dumpty, right? I said, what Humpty didn't fall, he hatched. But the King's Horses and Men are kind of interested in classification. They're interested in gathering up fragments and trying to understand those bits and pieces, but they're not ready to see a new kind of life form emerge from Humpty and just kind of take off. And that's what we have to be ready for in a city, which is constantly generating new forms of being and new forms of kind of I guess new answers to the question of like, who am I as a kind of group or as an individual?
Well, Marcin, you're well versed in Ulysses too, which sadly I never studied or learned enough, and that's the only way you're really going to break any sort of Finnegan's Wake code. And how do you apply that Humpty Dumpty metaphor in the wake to what you just said? Does it cross over into that as well? Because Joyce puts Humpty Dumpty in the wake, but does it cross over into Hatch's fall? Because the wake basically, to me, is simply you fall and you get back up. It's the human condition.
Yeah, I don't know if Joyce explicitly says there's so much rebirth in the wake that it's very easy to say, it's another kind of birth from the fragments, right? And horses and men are trained in torture and quartering, like ripping people apart. So why would they? So of course they're thinking about the shell. But you're right. More has more to do with kind of the Joyce's ideas about that, like you speak to me of. I hope I'm not mixing with portrait, but maybe it's portrait. You speak to me of religion, family, the state, or language. I tell you these are nets I will try to fly by, and how the kind of various structures that can be exceeded are kind of what he's trying to do with his writing. There's
this great clip from a documentary of McLuhan going around Toronto, and he's in the new City Hall, having just skated around Nathan Phillips Square in wintertime, and it's rather out of the blue, but he says all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again because they were bureaucrats.
Oh, that's so funny. Yeah, Clinton, that was my first project when I graduated from school, was the revitalization of Nathan Phillips Square. So me and Adrian Blackwell, my mentor, we're in charge of the furniture and some of the paths and plantings and advising on the new stage. Anyway, but so that's interesting. That's funny that I didn't know McLuhan had an experience there. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting because if I may, Gerry, I'm reading all of this books and culture talking about the collapse of the singular Cartesian individual subject, and so what comes next, and they always inevitably go through these analytical lenses like Deleuze and Guattari, which I don't know their work per se, but what I read today echoes a lot of postmodern social construction theory, which just talks about having multiple selves, which are all brought out by whatever environment or whatever social group you're in right now. And so there's a book I'm reading right now, which says it's making a case to end the dualist subject, where dualism means, you know, there's me on the inside and then there's me on the outside, right? The mind body split. And so for most of West, for the past couple hundred years, you know, we've had this dualism, which is McLuhan would say is owed to the printing press, right? There's my thinking on the inside and then there's a split, and there's no way to connect that to the outside. And so I understand, and so instead of restoring the mind bod, like instead of demonstrating how the conceptual difference between mind and body is different, what I see happen more often is it's sort of like this dualism plus, where it's just I've got a whole bunch of different personalities, right? And so they all just sort of coexist simultaneously in different parts. Bring me out. Kenneth Gergen calls it the saturated self. I'm every archetype, and everyone knows how to be a comedian when they have to, or how to do this when they have to, and we're inhabited by these multiple frames of reference. And so when you say that, you know, Humpty Dumpty hatched, I try to this it makes me think of this sort of, you know, higher level synthesis of trying to straddle multiple forms of being with, I'm not sure if they're even supposed to be some form of coherency or whatnot, but it's this sort of, you know, romanticization of things that it would be, well, of the schizo self in a literary sense. Not, we're not speaking at all in any sort of, you know, psychiatric pathological sense in these hypothetical theoretical constructs, of course, but you know, schizo being as something which is, you know, seems to be the predominant understanding, and that's how people understand their relation to environments, is who am I when I'm here, who am I when I'm there, who am I in church, who am I at work, who am I at home, right, etc., etc., etc. Is that like is what I'm seeing here or what I'm reading about aligning with kind of how this stuff is talked about in your circles?
Yeah, that was a great summary of it, because you answered Gerry's question much better than I did about this. I think he was asking about the literary dimension of a city, right? And I think exactly what you're saying is that, yeah, literature and mythology and these different even music, film, we have different senses of selves we can inhabit, right? They kind of give us an idea about, I think specifically through Quinter, like with thinking, feeling, and perceiving through, like, you know, through Hamlet, through these alternative bodies. That, as you say, though, as well, depends on, you know, are you in church or are you at a stadium? Obviously, you do different kinds of things when you're at a stadium than at a Thanksgiving dinner. It doesn't mean that you're lying here and you know, you're being fake here, you're being real in another place. It's more like a person is complicated enough to take on all these different dimensions. And of course, work through that kind of fragmentation of Humpty. But obviously, your friends still need to know who you are, right? Your friend is going to call you and be like, you know, which self am I talking to right now? You know, it doesn't really work. Like, you have to have, but I guess it's funny having watching. I have two little children, but you know, their faces just go like they go through like 20 emotions and kind of expressions in a second, you know, in a minute, and you learn how to kind of maintain a constancy, right, or kind of stability, at least for like a conversation topic, and then you can shift to the next, for your next answer from Gerry to be a whole different individual. But depends how you get animated. But it's an interesting question, like this idea of like how liberating is it? How I think this is the main question. It's like probably the most interesting question to me is like, who are you? How experimental is the self? Is it defined by the outside? But how can it totally be defined by the outside? You know, that's how I think the architecture and the body and the kind of personality relates to are related together, because you are a coherent object, and in some situations you are thinking of yourself as such, but then when you're dancing, when you're doing other things, intoxicated, you flow into the environment. So and become responsive in a different way. So that's just like no answers there, but just an interesting question about that interplay.
Mm-hmm.
No, that was good, Marcin, because I love this. We spoke with someone the other day, highbrow thinker, and it was like, I'm not into binaries, I'm not into dualities, and I love that because for 30 years I've asked the question, what's more important, conviction or compromise? That's like my big first question I started with interviewing people 30 years ago. It took 25 years before someone went, depends on what you mean by important. So the shift was always conviction or compromise, and they weren't hearing the another major part of the question. And so that's understandable. And I agree, because I want to go into center without margins, which is probably one of the most important things I've learned from studying McLuhan and Joyce. But one of our members is studying cybernetics, and he says, well, that's what the tetrad is. It's a system of 4 questions, and it's not just like science could be like one question. So this is contrary to all that. The next question is this equilibrium between feeling and thinking sustaining us? Is the equilibrium between feeling and thinking sustaining us?
Yes. First of all, what do I think about those? Like, thinking is about a kind of abstraction, because it is about, when you're thinking, it's like this, you leave your body and you're like mingling with other philosophers or in a kind of different world of ideas, right? So, whereas that's how I read it, or at least feeling seems to be the thing that grounds you into the situation and pulls you back in. So, the architect Louis Kahn says, sure, it's great to let thoughts kind of go off and mingle with other thoughts, but they have to come back to feelings sometimes. And he's like, they must come back and check in and say, like, how you doing?
Who says that, Marcin?
Louis Kahn, the architect.
Louis Kahn, we've talked about him. My favorite architect. Yes.
But sustain. On the question of sustain, I can't. It's a big word in architecture too, sustainability. Although I prefer regeneration. So this is tangential, but sustain is just like when you're playing piano, you have the pedal that you're holding on a pedal. It's like just indefinitely maintaining that course, which I don't think is nobody wants to do that. Like, sustainable. Like, you're not going to just infinitely sustain this moment. Resilience is another word used in architecture, but that's a bit like the environment. It's understood that it's under attack. How resilient is it? It puts the agency on the environment to bounce back and solve its own problem, solve the problems really capitalist destruction has caused. And then but regenerative is a better word. I think regenerative is a nice word because it has genesis in it. It has generate. It's the root of the word engine. Surprisingly, but so that's funny. But it doesn't sound strictly machinic. It sounds like things are coming back to life. That's the it's a particularly Joycean word.
That's the wake. The whiskey, the water of life's dripping on your open casket mouth, and you're up. But sustainability is also what we call media ecology. It's like being discerning. We've all decided to spend our time on the Zoom. We're discerning humans. We're like, well, I'm going to do this. But Clinton, let's go with you. Is the equilibrium between feeling and thinking sustaining us?
It's funny because if you have an equilibrium between thinking and feeling, is it the sort of thinking and feeling that's going on in the head of a romantic poet who's off in the world by himself, inventing his dream world, and then maybe writing some poetry, or is it? We started this video with this idea of the space, the external space itself as mind, and sensing. Are you sensing your environment while thinking about it? Are you living in the space in which you are presented, in which you are present. It's just as a side note, was really surprised when you talked about this this dichotomy you have about occupying and having an occupation, because for a while I've been trying to push this dichotomy of the identity of habits and habitat. You shape your habitat by the habits you have, which relate you to it, and it just seemed, it's really funny to hear the same formulation in a different word. It's the fact that these complementary terms are actually redundant in one language is really telling, I think. But it's precisely this involvement. So Gideon's term for the equilibrium you're describing is poise or equipoise, Gerry. So that's why I'm thinking of it in terms of thinking and feeling being your relationship to your environment, because you have poise like a gymnast. You are balanced and you are present in the environment, be it the social environment and the room that you're in as well. You know how to carry yourself. So yes, that's the very definition of what sustains us if you achieve it, I think. But again, in a dualist sense, you can be thinking and feeling like young Werther or Goethe or some romantic poet, and it's all in your head, and you're laying in a malaise on a rock somewhere in the middle of nature, trying to sketch a daffodil or some such thing. That's not the sort of sustaining impulse that I think is healthy at scale.
Thank you, both of you, because you helped me understand this phrase, words evoke more than their meaning. And I think it's infinite what happens with a chance for me to spend time with people like you. And, you brought up David Foster Wallace in his books called Infinite Jest. So that's an I and a J. And then what we maybe dabbled in tonight was intellectual judo. That's an I and a J. So, judo and jujitsu are sort of the most amazing etymological word. This is like, I'm always amazed. It means soft and gentle art and science. So it's like art and science, that's like, talk about a dichotomy. Maybe they're the same, maybe they're different. Something I would love to delve into more, but also I and J could stand for the inside joke. So, the point of McLuhan's mashup when we started this, Clint and I, was to bring to people, not in highbrow terms, and more like street lingo and lay people's terms, understanding of how our inventions shape us. And so here's a magazine article, and you can see it says time to unwire. So it's from, and there you have this animal caught in a barbed wire. Under the photo, don't fence me in. Even good fences make bad neighbors. So it's an article in The Economist about fences. And I thought we could do a tetrad together on fences. So this is an amazing thing because it reminds me of one of my favorite things I've learned in this world is center without margins. That we want to think that we can center our information and go, okay, here's what you both are deep thinkers and you study things and you can tell people about them. You're teachers. And being a student, and I'm always trying to learn. We'll start with you, Marcin. What does a fence enhance or intensify?
But by reifying divisions that might have been there but not physical, it either consolidates the property or the kind of the nation state, for example, in a way that keeps out the undesirable elements. So it enhances very intangible divisions that might have been there before, but by making a place more desirable or making it even more excluded. And really, the rise of the nation state is the rise of fencing off the so-called barbarians or whoever's trying to take your resources and consolidate your social group. I think the social group is, which might have been before, something way more about like bloodlines or something, or some kind of connection to a territory. All that's replaced by fence, really the fortress.
Yeah, and it's amazing because in doing Tetrad, and that's why Kissinger's so astute in utilizing this analysis to run the world. It's not what the fence is and what it was intended to be by whoever invented fences. Like, who invented fences? It's what the hidden psychic effect of fences is. And I thought in what you said was intangibility is a great one-word answer. And again, with Tetrad, I always say, let me help suss out a word or two, but you suss it out to understand, help us understand what the big picture is. So that was very good. Clinton, what does a fence enhance or intensify?
My first thought was something like ownership, like property ownership, which could entail like responsibility for the inside. Like a garden is cultivated, and lots of gardens exist inside of a fenced area, right? Here and no further, right? This is your responsibility, sort of aspect of a fence.
Really good, because ownership ends with the word ship, and that's what cybernetics is steering the ship and navigating. So very good. Marcin, what does a fence render obsolete or displace? And you throw time out the window. It's like when a car renders a horse and buggy obsolete, it doesn't mean there's no more horse and buggies. We still have them, and they're an art form. You go on a romantic stroll with your partner in New York City on a horse and buggy. So what does a fence render obsolete or displace?
I want to say ships, just because that's what you were just talking about.
That is good.
I'm going to say ships because whereas I want to think of things like ancient civilizations as really Mediterranean civilizations, not Greek, not Egyptian. Really, if you talk about the Mediterranean, that's the space of correspondence and economic and cultural trade. Egypt is a Mediterranean civilization. So is Greece. So Alexander the Great is born in Turkey, for God's sakes. So is Aristotle, where he teaches them. Present day Turkey. So meaning bodies of water are way better to understand how civilization functions until you have this kind of consolidation around Athens and definition of territory and countries that come from the fence. They displace this thinking of the ship as, in Deleuze's term, like a nomadic space of correspondence.
Beautiful. Okay, Mr. Clinton, you're up. What does a fence render obsolete?
Oh, I was thinking like properties near cliffs, something like this.
Well, that's the great joke.
Maybe. Yeah.
The guy falls off the cliff and he's hanging on to a root on the side of the mountain, and he yells, "Help, help, is there anyone who can help me?" The clouds part and God's voice goes, "I am God, I can help you. Let go of the root and I'll save you." Guy yells, "Is there anyone else who can help me?" Okay, the next step of the tetrad, Marcin, is retrieve. What does a fence bring back that we got rid of?
Let's say it's stargazing. Now I want to be like slightly provocative and contrarian and one word answers. Stargazing. I'm always
well,
amazed.
That is really yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
I mean, I'm always amazed. Just I think you could be all kinds of arrogant about our so-called advances, right? But surely the biggest regression wasn't understanding how how what happens with stars, the kind of cosmological or kind of astronomical, astrological, thinking about the movements of the celestial orbs, right? That was an advanced knowledge that is not commonplace anymore, partially because of this kind of focus on the Earth, and you can circumnavigate your own territory around the fence. But at the same time, the fence, since it guards you around, it does want to make you look up in a sense, because that's the axis that's left is the upward axis. And paradoxically, in a big city that is let's say bound, even though it's not really, but in big cities nowadays, the air pollution makes it so that you don't have this upward possibility. So you have a kind of sense of enclosure, missing that kind of axis, even though you're kind of compelled to want to have that.
It's beautiful because, Marcin, somehow you've just tapped into what the tetrad is. And the book, The Lost Tetrads, which I think Eric McLuhan, Marshall's son, put out a couple years ago, they call tetrads are poetry meets hieroglyphics. So, everybody, we do these 4 times a week with a whole group of people, and I go, don't think, just go with your hunch. And it's so fun. Clinton, what does a fence retrieve?
Well, as soon as we got, I thought, oh my goodness, what's older than a fence, right? So I've been thinking in very linear times chronologically. So cave wall, perhaps the painted cave wall. What have you? But yeah, I'm being very literal, I suppose.
No, that's right. Go ahead, Marshall.
It's cool though, because Gerry just mentioned the hieroglyphics. No, it's actually pretty cool to think that the different kinds of bulls and different kinds of animals painted on the cave walls are literal constellations. So in a way, what is the older drawing? Is it the drawing in the stars, the constellations, or the drawing on the cave wall?
Yeah, and bravo to Herzog for doing the Forgotten Dreams cave painting movie. But the article that he based it on or was inspired him from the New Yorker is an essential read, because it really talks deep. Because, I often ask people in my interview, what was the motive of the cave artist? And don't tell me what you've read in anthropology books or from Herzog's, on your own hunch. What is it? So, Marcin, what is a fence? What could a fence flip into if you press it to an extreme?
An inhabitable border, partially because I'm thinking from an architecture point of view. The extreme of the fence becomes a space. It becomes inhabitable in its own right, as not just something that divides this from that, but something that you can look from. The zone between North Korea and South Korea is a thick space. The Berlin Wall used to be, before the physical wall, was a larger space. But this idea that you inhabit the interstitial space, that's an old architecture idea too. Like the loggia, the kind of colonnade, as a kind of intermediate space that's not quite inside or outside. But the idea that the wall itself is inhabitable, allowing you to mediate between the inside and outside, allowing you to also have a peripheral status, and with Deleuze's idea about the minoritarian, the peripheral status is the creative status, because the creative location to be in, because it's what can set the dominant language in motion. So Kafka writing in German, but as a Jew in Prague, allows him to totally mess with and deterritorialize the German language because of his kind of location and position. So not being engulfed and subsumed in the center. So those are the virtues of a kind of inhabitable wall as a creative peripheral space.
Marcin, evoked visually 2 amazing things. The picture is the cattle caught in the top wire, that's inevitable. I can't. And then it just really made me flash on, my friend is in a Stanley Kubrick film called Paths of Glory. His name's Timothy Carey. And it is just, you're in that trench in the war. that war, that is inhandleable. You're like, this is like, it's supposed to save you, but at the same time, it has that dark dungeon death to it all. Okay, Clinton, what could a fence flip into when pressed to an extreme?
A fault line.
Yeah. Don't say that too loud.
Don't hammer those posts down too deep, guys. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, don't say that too loud. I live in California, and nature may be listening. But Clinton does this all the time with us. And Marcin, your tetrad on the wake. What does it enhance? Reader's connection to history. What does it render obsolete? Encyclopedia Bible. What does it retrieve? Bad behavior reframed as life-affirming behavior. And what does it flip into? Religion of statistics. The bill, that is amazing. Now, the cave one was so good too. What does a cave enhance? Social group, family group, campfire, this whole idea that every tetrad's retrieval stage can be the campfire, the water cooler, the schoolyard. Why do humans invent anything? So that we can be together in a campfire. What does a cave render obsolete? Weather, micro earth within earth, control over nature. Good luck. Cave, what does it retrieve? This was the doozy, Marcin. Teeth, canine teeth, specifically eating animal flesh before we invented hunting and flaming flesh. That answer in doing tetrads for 30 years was so good for that retrieval, because the retrieval stage of the tetrad usually gets people. And I just say campfire. It's an all-purpose answer. But when you said teeth, and I just wanted to remind people, the last step of Marcin's tetrad on cave, what does it flip into? Either the grave, you become one with the landscape, or cinema, the moving narrative lit up by reflected torch. That's Herzog saying, these guys invented cinema. So
Brilliant.
yeah, so I'm sort of coming to an end and thanking you both for so much. If you guys have any other kind of comments, I appreciate it. And I have a couple other closing sort of round robin-ish things, but anything else you all want to bring up, feel free.
I'd like to respond to Finnegan's Wake pushed to the extreme, leading to the religion of statistics, because I've been reading The Freudian Robot by Lydia Liu, which precisely describes how Claude Shannon used Finnegan's Wake as an example of a text of very high entropy relative to the basic English model, which is being developed by I.A. Richards. So the rendering of the English language into a statistically measured landscape for the sake of generating predictive text. So basically, Gerry, like the autocomplete on your phone is based largely on the difference of how complicated Finnegan's Wake is compared to how complicated, say, like a Dick and Jane book is, as a very rigorous mathematical model developed in the 50s by Claude Shannon at the Bell Telephone Laboratories when they were trying to create new ways to compress information and measure information as like this sort of thermodynamic or a space of probabilities. So it was just very relevant to hear that. I recommend this book though, because it also goes into then how that influenced Jacques Lacan in how he formed the symbolic layer of his three level of cognition, and sort of thus created the book's title, The Freudian Robot, because at least in English, the cybernetic association of Lacan's idea of like the symbolic level, but is not at all tied to the history of information theory at whatsoever. So that's what she's trying to retrieve in English. Maybe the awareness is more there in France, but it's totally lost in English, and what that means for subsequent thinkers who build on Lacan, and how poorly they're understood in English has got cultural ramifications for what's properly called postmodernism and all that good stuff. Yeah. So, anyways, that was just a cool tangent. Thank you, Gerry.
Yeah, no, thanks for that tangent, because we got to get Peter Quadrino on that book, man. He knows how to dig deep into those catacombs of Wakey, and the Wake is a business. And Marcin, before I go into these last two, any other topics, comments, or anything you want to bring up? Feel free, because I mean we've sucked up a lot of your time. You don't have to.
No, can I ask? Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Yeah, the last part, the last thing you quoted before, though, Gerry, was set up this question. I got it from Foucault. This idea that he says the Bible is structured like a circle with God in the center, and that's also like a medieval city with the church in the center. The encyclopedia is structured like a grid, with every passage has an equal status, even if some are longer. Encyclopedia is a grid, and so is the infrastructural city, electricity, plumbing, kind of grid layout, road layout. Then he comes to the speculative third regime. He's like, interestingly, the third one is structured. The third organization of knowledge, if you will, is structured like a river. That has particular resonance with Finnegan's Wake, because it starts with the word river run. But he says the analog to that in terms of the organization of knowledge is statistics, partially because of this idea of a constant flux and acting on a future that's not entirely known. Because of Clinton, you've got this expertise in kind of data and this kind of emerging technologies. Like, I'd like to think about those as another mechanism of defining a self. Like, I wonder if you talk about this kind of question of, we touched on this kind of idea about the biotechnic and this idea that forms of control or ordering of the world are turned back on the individual. How do you see that kind of contemporary technologies or data kind of implicated in this whole game of how do I define what a person is? Autocorrect might define what I'm trying to say before I know what I'm trying to say. But what do you think about that whole stream there?
Yes. Well, historically speaking, we've used contemporary technologies, the technology which is contemporary to the age, as a form of metaphor for understanding ourselves. Right. So, Freud looked at drives and everyone's under pressure, or stuff like this. The whole idea of having a train of thought came about during the age of locomotives, right? And of course the line of thought coming from the line of text on your printed page, right, being very logical and whatnot. Now, what's interesting about contemporary computers, with the microcomputer, and especially with, say, the Macintosh in the 80s, is that their interfaces are total lies, which totally hide the underlying infrastructure, and instead they give us all these easy to use metaphors. And the metaphors that people take from computers nowadays, for instance, multitasking, are not real. They're not based on any real property of the computer. They're based on the fictitious nature of having 3 documents on your desk, and you're shuffling those documents around to find one. So the constitutive technology of our age, when artists and people are reaching for language and metaphors to make sense of themselves, they aren't even using the actual technology. They understood more about the technology when it was hard to use, and you appreciated that it took computer programming to use a computer, and that it was all this data analysis, and it was math and whatnot. We understood computers better then than we do now, because our familiarity with them gives us all of these false make-believe high-level affordances and interfaces that then we're using for metaphors for ourselves. Oh, I'm a great multitasker, or oh, I burned out. It's not even a real concept. The CPU is, got all the RAM space, or what there's no multitasking going on, or it's all multitasking, right? It's just one giant flickering circuit board. So I see there's a big problem in what I'm calling cyberspace. Earlier today, you said, I've got 6 different tabs open in my web browser, and so I'm in these 6 different spaces. And it's like, yes, insofar as you treat the content as long as you reify it, you imbue it with a sense of reality, which it absolutely does not have. The only real thing is you sitting in front of a heavily complicated bunch of wires flickering lights in your face. And if you don't see through to that first, then you're interfacing through this black box input output illusion thing, which is what N. Catherine Hale's looks at, through the origin of cybernetics as people being spliced into machines at the wrong level. Because we're interfacing with these machines not for what they are. We're interfacing for them for what they lie to us. They pretend to be easy to use or whatever, which is always the old thing. Yeah.
Now, would McLuhan call that the rear view mirror look because the file folder is on your desktop or something, or the fact that it is the desktop.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, but
exactly.
That was a great. Thank you for that statement though, because despite it not being true to what's happening in the mechanism, like you said though, it constructs a sense of identity. So that's the kind of, it's very real on the level of people thinking of themselves as multitaskers. So that's kind of amazing that the metaphors stick and they become a way of kind of constructing a person and how they operate, how your sense of time, your sense of space is altered, your idea about efficiency or about themselves in relation to that. It's kind of amazing that it is producing all these metaphors as well as occluding. When John Harwood in his book on the interface, he says that the hiding of the mechanism is deliberate in order to allow for the more seamless connection of your body with it. So all the design attention is paid to exactly what you're saying, which is covering up the complexity, because then you would treat it as something outside and separate from it. So they want a direct line to this, I guess, the psychological part of what you're talking about, and on that level, I mean, I don't want to go into a Derrida game, but I'm interested in where materials come from, but I don't know if I don't think I'm ever, we're never reaching the authentic per se, but we can have a degree of freedom, at least I think, by uncovering some of these occlusions, I guess, or kind of blankets.
Yeah, well, if you worked in a cinema in 1950, or as Joyce did, in the 10s, the 20s, for crying out loud, how deep could you go into figuring out the projector? You might want to figure out how the film is made, and you end up in a chemistry lab somewhere where they're producing film. You want to know how the mechanism is worked, and you're at some basically like a clockmaker's machine, right? However the hell they make these highly accurate film projectors, right? You want to know how the movie is made. You end up on a film set somewhere, exploring, chasing down every avenue with your exploration of what is this thing that has this magical effect that creates a dream world. I want to get to the bottom of this dream world. There's all these physical spaces you can pop out on. But for a young person with a cell phone today, they all end up, I'm going to program a video game, or I'm going to be a YouTube star, or I'm going to, they probably never ever going to break down to ending up in a mine somewhere on the other side of the world, watching someone try to chisel out some rare earth mineral from a cave, right? The actual device itself and all the small levels of it is so microscopic and so buried under. They're not going to end up walking around. Well, they might walking around Intel or AMD or some ARM chip manufacturer, learning how it takes, a team of 50 architects to design the CPU. They're not going to learn all the extra extensions that went into, the 64-bit CPU architecture, right, as it expanded on the original x86 architecture. Well, one guy was crazy enough to do that, actually, and it drove him insane. Terry Davis, actually, the dude's an absolute nut. But it's like he's the example that proves the rules, that when you've got a computer and you want to get down to the bottom of it, it's nothing like it was even only 50 years ago with the kids who fall in love with the mediums of those days and play guitar, or maybe make guitars, or become rock stars, or become guitar teachers, right? So the world we create through our media, the computer is doing something a little bit different than has all preceding media, I believe, and that's why it takes extra scrutiny.
Yeah, Gerry asked earlier, a question about what sustains us, and I'm thinking about it, like what creates the idea of us, or like cinema or these interfaces, how they create a kind of idea about us. But then, like you say, Clinton, when you try to track them down, the specificity of it, suddenly you find out that the whole world is conspiring to produce that thing, because it's not just the labor and the landscapes that were altered by the material of these circuit boards or of this film. It's also, what is the person extracting material? What did they have for breakfast that day? And where did that energy come from? And what farm was that from? And suddenly you realize that the whole universe, because it was the sun that fed that created the vegetation that the cow ate, that the person ate, or that also led to this kind of some kind of geological transformation that suddenly the whole universe is part of that experience. So talk about a crazy analysis of ecology, and that's what you have to go insane to do that kind of analysis.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So it's interesting. Is this a sort of, I suppose the word is ontology that would follow from what Foucault was saying from the Bible through to the encyclopedia thereafter? It all goes rhizomic, I guess. Is that the word?
Yeah, rhizomatic. Yeah.
Rhizomatic. Yeah. What do you think of that, Gerry?
I was really intrigued by that. You guys could have carried this whole thing without my smart ass little inserts, but this is when Marcin brought up the word metaphor, it was so good because, again, we can quote till the cows come home, and you guys are so good at this. And McLuhan heard Browning's line, "Our reach should exceed our grasp, or what is heaven for?" And he reverted it. "Our reach should exceed our grasp, or what is a metaphor?" So this is what, the wake is, a living organism, that it's not a book, it's a living organism if you're reading it with a group of people. And it reminds me of the first review ever of film screenings in Paris, the late 1800s. The newspaper Le Poste said, "Now we'll never die," which is true. Frank Zappa's not dead. He forgot to die. You can watch him for 10 hours being interviewed on YouTube in one link. And I recommend you watch every minute of it. But we can never die. And so you go to the Bible of dying, which is Finnegan's Wake, which is wake up, people, not Finnegan's apostrophe wake about a guy's death service. It's about switching it, getting rid of the apostrophe and saying all us Finnegans wake. And so whenever we read it in Texas together on these amazing Zooms, I say, there's no content in this book. And everybody's there like, blah, blah, blah. We're talking about content. And I love it. Of course there's content in it. But about the third or fourth time, Sherry went, "Aren't you going to tell us there's no content, Gerry?" Which is so funny because she's Jungian and Blakean. But just to go full circle, what you started with, Marcin, was great because Joan Didion says, "I don't know what I think until I wrote it." And Marshall says, "I don't know what I think until I say it." So my rewording is, I don't know what I think until I ask somebody else, like smart people like you. So we could close out if you want. I mean, I'm just feeling we could go on forever. But Valery, or is that how you pronounce his name? The great French poet, Valery, Valery. He said, "Is there unity in nature?" So we'll start with you, Marcin. Is there unity in nature?
I like there to be multiplicity in nature. I think just because it's funny, the unity, the reduction to a unit is the same that happens to the individual, like the human body. That means that the person that can't be divided, where obviously you can, because you just ate a couple of organisms that are in you. You have bacteria that are in you. You have vaccines that are in you. So you're already multiple. The unity as a kind of fake coherence is not cool, because why do that? Why? I mean, I guess to keep you from grappling with the crazy multiplicity of the thing.
That was beautiful, because you put the word multiplicity. There's a city at the end of that word. Words evoke more than their meaning.
I don't even think a city is a unity, Gerry. I think a city is like constantly spreading and superimposing different neighborhoods that are
it's not a unity till you build the fence.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Boy, Clinton is so good at saying, we talked about at the beginning. Now, Clinton, is there unity in nature? No. Is there unity in mashup Zooms? No. Is there unity in nature?
Yes, but only in like the absolute ultimate sort of way that doesn't matter. Yes, but you can't build anything on it if right. Is there unity in the universe? You might say yes. Who cares? It's a very poor metaphysical scaffolding for anything useful whatsoever. Right?
Oh yeah, is that because you have to be above the unity to act on it? Because like, is the unity only useful when it's like below you? Like you have to be a scale up. But like,
you're probably watching too many Carl Sagan documentaries, or just like smoking weed, going crazy. Like you can't really, there's no grounding, like you said, at the level where the universe has unity. You'd have to place yourself outside of it, and because you're not, you're just setting yourself up for a fall, you could say. But be a pretty big fall, wouldn't it?
I'm setting myself up for a hatch, not a fall. So when Valerie asked that question to Albert Einstein said, is there unity in nature? Albert said, it's an act of faith. So, we always say, you believe in your blooming world, or as this, about 10 years into my Finnegan's Wake reading club in Venice, an old Irish drunk showed up at our meeting, and he sat there looking at us, and about halfway through the meeting, he goes, do you guys believe this shit? So here's a maybe concluding, but we could go on forever. Can we unweave the spell of buildings with buildings, or can we unweave the spell of architecture with architecture?
Unweave is the word you're using?
Yeah.
Interesting choice of word.
I think I got it from your writings. What do you think, Marcin?
Unweave architecture with architecture. Yeah, it's just such an interesting choice of word, because Gottfried Semper uses weaving as the metaphor for, as the thing architecture should look to instead of classical references, because he traces the word architecture to textere. Textere had a relationship with textiles and with weaving, as like kind of canopies and tent-like structures. And even if you're weaving palm or different kind of leaves, or for a thatched roof or something, that's weaving. And then there's the scaffolding of the structure, and then walls were presumably also like woven kind of screens, right? Sorry, that's just it's just an interesting choice of word, because we also use the word urban fabric as a kind of funny textile metaphor there, right? But if it is woven, there's always this perpetually loose ends, and it's a kind of, I guess it's also a kind of like a thicker textile. And I think you're right. I think things are always constructing and deconstructing, like the Tower of Babel. It's kind of in perpetual construction and deconstruction somehow, and there never is a singular sense that architecture is always kind of focusing on control, because there's always ways that, in some cases, it's kind of enhancing your freedom, or there's a public space, or there's a festival where all the rules break down, or some other some infrastructure that really interestingly both connects and it disconnects. Like a highway or something. It's meant to connect 2 points that are very far away, while disconnecting very immediate locations where it cuts through. So in a funny way, your question is interesting, because there could be simultaneous woven and unraveling and disconnection and oppression, control, but also kind of liberating forces. Because architecture, I mean, this is kind of dumb, but wall backwards almost spells law. But
Oh yeah, good one. That is really good. Almost it does.
the L is silent. No, the extra L is for hell. Another BYOB joke. But architecture doesn't want to. It wants to enable you to do something you couldn't do. It's meant to enhance your freedom, but by doing so, its method is mostly possible with walls. So there's a kind of paradoxical idea about can enclosure can actually enhance your freedom, or is it fundamentally about limiting what you can do? But as we know from dance, you have a skeleton, and it lets you. It's a structure that enables some other things to happen, but it needs to be a supple structure and open to adjustments and improvisations if it's going to have this unraveling or unweaving quality that you mentioned.
Well put. When you create a law, you create the opportunity to break the law. So it's almost backwards to do it. And you really invoked symmetry, because we were studying that last week. Because, we think most buildings are symmetrical. Most everything's symmetrical. And these rug designers, I don't know, in American Indians or India, they design these rugs and they're perfectly symmetric. And then they put one little mistake over here not a mistake, but a purpose to see if anyone's really paying attention. Okay, so Clinton, you are up. What was the question? Can we unweave the spell of zooms with zooms? No. Can we unweave the spell of architecture with architecture?
My first thought when I heard the question was that of, new skyscrapers eclipsing older, smaller buildings, which would probably have a devastating effect on the intentions of the architect, depending on the light that the building was supposed to receive. But I mean that's a really literal interpretation. I really like where you went there with the whole weaving thing, because if I were to if I were to think about weaving, I'd immediately separate it into hand woven and then like post loom, sort of how the metaphor of weaving works. And so that goes a lot into what I was reading about the experience of architects in the 80s, while the craft was being computerized in simulation. And anthropologist Sherry Turkle spends a lot of time talking to architecture students and teachers, talking about these new computers being integrated into the curriculum, and people learning how to use architectural drafting software for the first time, and what they got and what was taken away from the experience of sitting there with a pencil and a calculator and a slide ruler and all the various tools of the trade, where the architect was building simultaneously on paper and in their head this building through doing all the math themselves, so as to understand and plot every dimension, every point of the building as they're building it up. And the first thing the architects experienced using commercial architectural software was it did all the measurements for them, and it had a whole bunch of simulated suggested defaults as to how big doorways are and how big columns are and all this stuff, and it would suggest most of the building to them prefabricated in the form in the software. And half of them hated it, half of them loved it, right? You had people printing off their designs and throwing them on the floor and rolling around on top of them, trying to get into the building, right? Or like trying to recalculate what the computer already did perfectly, just so they actually knew what was going on, because they felt they had been robbed with the sense of doing any architecture for having the measurements be automatically calculated, that sort of thing. So in a way, that's like computer architecture unweaving what actual real architecture, which it took its name from, had woven over centuries, right?
Nice. Yeah. It's like the software, the way you're describing it, it's like the autocorrect for architecture, right? It's hard to do poetry with autocorrect on. So Yeah, but that was funny with people rolling around in the drawings. That's true that, to really get into the plan, people try to physically put their finger on, here's the doorway, I walk through the plan. It's a very different kind of inhabitation. And you're right that software creates an image of a building, but then when you look closer, you're like, well, there's like no deliberate kind of intention that guided all the decisions, like you mentioned, there might be kind of default decisions. And you find out soon that no one medium is good enough to make architecture. You have to draw plans, you have to make models, you have to make life-size mock-ups and detail studies and have the real materials and test them with your own bodies, right? Map it out in your space, do section drawing, plan drawing, all different points of view. And, almost like a nomadic drift between forms of representation before you kind of, or as you articulate this thought of this kind of complexity in your mind, which can never be represented.
It's like we're all flaneurs, even though we think we live in houses. We're all wandering aimlessly. I learned today on the news that thinking that I'm getting dementia in my old age, they said, if you lose your keys, you're just being forgetful. If you look at your keys and wonder what they're for, then you're getting dementia. So I don't do that quite yet, but I won't forget this time. And if I do, I can always hit YouTube and relive it with you two gentlemen. Thank you so much. And I suggest we probably could do this once a month, how much I've learned. And maybe the next one could be based on two great documents. The interview I did with Bob Dobbs once is called Entertainment Sucks. And then Matt Gleason, great publisher of the magazine Coagula in Los Angeles. It was an art magazine that criticized art criticism. His book is called Most Art Sucks. So we could talk about entertainment and art, and of course that's a binary that could blossom into the great poet Auden, who said, the mystery of art is that we don't know if it activates or pacifies us. So anybody have any closing comments? Go ahead, Clinton.
Yeah, my closing comment. I really appreciate this conversation, especially because when I was reading this book about it's an essay called "Simulation and Its Discontents" by Sherry Turkle, right? And I've been, in my own way, because of my interest, thinking about simulation as that dream on the other side of the computer screen that everybody constantly thinks that they're interacting with, right? The simulation is on the other side of the screen, but based on what we've been saying, Marcin, it's like no, that simulation is itself invested exactly in the very architecture of the artifice of our total environment. When, as we were saying, with autocorrect and auto-generated buildings and the forms which imbue it in us, just because the material is physical and real and you can knock up against it doesn't make it perhaps not still a simulation, when upon tracing back its origin you find it you sort of run up against these dead ends, right? So yeah, the people who go crazy thinking that they're trapped in a simulation, I can sort of put myself in their imagination a little bit in an unsettling way, a little too more uncannily, which is a good thing, but it's thought provoking.
All right, Marcin, any closing comments?
Just a fun discussion, and yeah, Clinton, thanks for all the really great insights, and Gerry, you framed stuff very very nicely that moved us along, that maybe kind of think of new things for sure, and a lot of these questions about not thinking about what something is or trying to define it to coherently thinking about what it does, what affects it has, or what kind of other entanglements does it contain that allows it to do something, right? Even with your quote of when you mentioned Cookie Pollock, you said, I could do that. Well, even there, it's funny that they're not asking, what is that supposed to be? They're kind of immediately shifting to the action and to the movement that generated the work. So that's even astute reading of it. And I'd love to talk more with you guys about things like like space-time and Einstein. Gerry mentioned, but I was gonna try to sneak in this idea about where he says, Einstein says that space-time is a mollusk, like the shell of a snail.
Yeah.
So it's like an actual it's something that's shaped by matter and energy as well. But the fact that on the point of simulation, like the ultimate simulation of our own interiority, if that's kind of designed or is that, why are we feeling a certain way? Well, maybe it's art historical training, or you can't even trust your own reactions to things. So it's a kind of particularly disturbing contemporary phenomena where your whole identity is tied with certain beliefs, and if those are attacked, it actually kind of consolidates them more, and you feel them viscerally, but you can't necessarily trust that. I mean, that's kind of stuff that I'd love to also keep talking about in this conversation about art and entertainment.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Marcin, because Sunra says that music is rocket fuel, and we've really blasted off in this Zoom, and he said space is the place. So I wanted to recall one or two closing things. Was Matisse or Cézanne said, if you take your painting and put it in the bushes and it blends in, it's a good painting. So I think our Zoom tonight just sort of blended into YouTube, and it came out pretty good. I appreciate that. In this whole simulation theory, yes, definitely space-time simulation theory. We got to go deeper into that because my friend Rodney Asher's film's going to premiere in Sundance in February, and it's called the Glitch in the Matrix, and it's based on a lecture that Philip K. Dick did about simulation, and Philip K. Dick loved Finnegan's Wake. He knew it was a big memory theater, and he's one of those guys you could say, well, he liked it, and people go, wow, I gotta check this out. And Philip K. Dick liked it.
Let's get a lot of mileage out of that one, eh, Gerry?
Yeah. And so I saw a T-shirt that said The Matrix was a documentary, and so I know indeed that this session was not a documentary. It was indeed scripted. So as Clinton pushes the button to end it, it's going to burn the entire written screenplay for this Zoom, and poof, it's gone. Thank you, guys. I love you both.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.